and then unmute, when you have a comment or question, and do so fairly freely instead of in a structured way. Sounds more fun to me. Okay, and so we have a group of people on the screen here, 5 of whom uploaded pre-recorded presentations of their research. And that was from psychology, it was Adam Hicks and Maddie Adolph and Meg Mumaw, that you see here. And then from English, Steve Zwilling and Zach Shepard. And so the rest of us are spectators and commentators and visitors. And so the operating assumption is that everybody has seen all 5 of these videos. And so you've seen 3 from psychology and 2 from English. And there's some, as Dr. Bowers Campbell and I were talking, to me as a psychologist, the 3 psychology ones look really different from each other. But when I zoom out and add the 2 English ones to this, all the psychology ones look just alike. And then you have, a whole different approach to thinking about things, from the English students. So we have methodology, and my students were asking about that this morning. This was so interesting hearing the English presentations, and it's doesn't overlap to an extent. It doesn't overlap with what the term research means in one discipline compared to the other. So I need to be creative and come up with a question for the group. Is that?
You can, or you can have them, if you want to have them talk about impact.
Yeah, there was one takeaways from their. There was one question. There is one question, and either Zach or Steve can go first on this, but it would be helpful for the psych people on the screen. I don't think the English people need this, but what's the significance of Horace Gephardt himself? Y'all are doing a deep dive with historical letters among family members, but all that kind of hinges on who was Horace. Why do we care about him? And so on behalf of the psychology people on the screen, somebody take that one on.
I can
go, Steve. Yeah.
So Horace Gephardt was a naturalist, conservationist, among many other things, this side of the North Carolina. He had a huge family, obviously. We got letters mostly from his wife, who's Laura, but his influence in Western North Carolina was from, he influenced the Blue Ridge Parkway. He met with a lot of indigenous people around this area. He did a lot to kind of influence change in Western North Carolina and kind of with the New Deal in some areas as well. Yeah. And Zach could probably elaborate on more. This is kind of in his realm as well.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, the main introduction to Horace Gephardt is, the national park. It was when he got off the train at Bryson City, where the place that he wrote about in his main publication was, in his book, was what later became the national park. So I guess the archival research from that is to kind of contextualize the man versus the figure is kind of how I looked at it. We have this, like, you can drive around Western North Carolina and you see historical nameplates everywhere, whether this mountain was named and trekked by this person, or, you see these kind of nameplates. So it's a really, really unique opportunity to do the deep dive into letters and the photos and to kind of see the human essence behind what has now become some sort of like a mythologized figure. So kind of adding, we study stories, so we always want to add the full realm of characteristics to somebody. So it's kind of doing that with a figure of significance in the region and significance in American history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you were looking at the letters, what when you find the letter, say, okay, this is going to be the thing I focus on. What questions go through your mind? What is it you're trying to get out of that letter?
Well, we were lucky enough to be assigned the letters. There's by Dr. Wright. So thankfully she just divvied them out to us. There's so many to go through that that would have taken, gosh, 2/3 of the project would be deciding which one you want to work on.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but when you get the letter, and we had it was last semester, so we didn't have access to the actual letters. We had photographs of them,
Mm-hmm.
digitized versions already. So your first thing is, okay, I need to read it. Your first thing is it's in this tight script. So the first thing is I need to figure out what it says. And then it's what do I need to figure out so that I understand what's going on in it? And if I understand what's going on in it, what extra stuff do I need so that someone else can understand what's going on in it? So it's just, your first question is, what questions do I need to ask? It's one of those things. There's not a list of set questions that you need to figure out with transcription stuff. It's more of the question is finding questions. What questions need to be asked so that I can get as good a picture of this letter as possible.
Yeah, I'll echo that, definitely. What stuck out for me, and a question that I ask myself often with these transcriptions, is what is it even saying? Because I got one of the later letters, which was written when she was about 92. So the penmanship, or 93, the penmanship was, I could hardly read what she was actually trying to make out some of the time. And oftentimes there were mistakes that she made later on that she didn't make in earlier letters. So I often had to refer to like Zach's letter, which was like 46 or something like that. And then ones from like 30s where I don't want to say she was losing it by any means, but when she was 93, she just wasn't as kind of on it as she was cognitively. So I had to go through the penmanship and kind of understand handwriting in itself and how it evolved to really understand what she was trying to make out. Like she would mix up A's and E's, and she would add emphasis to words that she didn't do or add emphasis to in like Zach's letter or even earlier letters. So it almost evolved over that 20 years or 18 years, whatever it was. So that's kind of a major focus for me. And then once I understood what she was trying to say, then I could start annotating and transcribing. So it was kind of a lesson in that.
I appreciate your sensitivity to the aging issue. And Dr. Kinzer, did you have a hand up here?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of build on your question, David, and ask Zach and Steve, as performances of life writing, this genre that we include, in which we include letters, journals, things, the main point is not so much the fame of the writer, but the life of the writer. And I'm wondering if you had some time to think about what you learned in terms of these letters as, cultural archives, biographical archives, but also as literary performances, as life writing.
I anticipated that this would be where the conversation drifted. So I was thinking about this earlier, actually. In terms of studying literature, studying stories, and studying writers, I mean, Laura Kephart is a brilliant writer. She's able to. My letter was just. There's nothing. It's what we call life writing. It deals with the significant and the insignificant. There doesn't have to be some major overhauling concept that's being discussed. Like my letter was simply a weekend in May, and she's just kind of detailing a few things that happened to her. She's a brilliant writer. When I teach my students, the main thing I try to tell them is transparency in writing, to be able to see through the words on the page and the page itself, to see the person behind it. And she does a brilliant job of that, even just in this brief letter that I had. You get a sense of her, but when you read it, I was thinking about earlier, it's an easy bridge between times. The content in her letter dealt with labor strikes and car accidents and family members not being around as often as they used to be. Like that letter could easily have been written in 2021 as an email, but it just so happened to be written in 1946 as a handwritten letter. So yeah, the image of Laura Kephart that I was able to get through transcribing my own and then reading the others' letters and then reading some of the more official biographical information that you find through the sources was it just added a lot of texture to her as a character, as a person, to me as a writer. I think she's, like I said, I'll say it again, she's a magnificent writer. If you've ever read letters from 1946, they're not interesting. Some of them, some of the language is really, really dry. She has a profound hold and grasp on language, and she's just able to speak through her pen. And that's something that is, it's really interesting to look at, no matter what period of time you're looking at.
Which also interrogates our notions of what constitutes interesting, right? And what we value to claim interest. This is interesting, this is not interesting, that the whole process of life writing addresses that issue, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I definitely had the same experience. Even when she was upwards in her 90s, she still had engaging texture to her writing and how she kind of approached things. She was almost hilarious in some parts. So she had this ability to kind of intermingle this vulnerability with extreme humor. So she was talking about how lonely she was because she was in a nursing home and she was going back and forth from her daughter and her daughter's house and the nursing home. And she at one point made fun of her daughter's husband's family, so her in-laws, claiming that they were kind of crazy because she's fun to be around. And then she kind of seamlessly went into thanking her children for being so accepting and loving, and then going on to kind of facetiously make fun of them for not wanting to have her around, but that wasn't actually the case by any means. So I got a glimpse into her life and her personality and how she was as a person, and it definitely was channeled into her writing pretty seamlessly.
Yes. So flash forward 300 years when we're reading these letters saying, oh my God, why did they put their elders in nursing homes? And what the hell is that?
Yeah, my mom would do the same thing, I think.
Let me try a bridge that may not work. It may not get us there. I mean, this bridge could be one of those where you just fall off at the midpoint. It may not bridge, but just as it's a sudden leap here. What did the English half of this screen, I'm looking at this Zoom screen, the English half of the people here, what did you think when you looked at Maddie's denouement? Her culmination was a correlation table. It was a screen full of numbers taken to the second decimal place, some of which had special annotations around them, like they meant something. Did too far this bridge? This was a bridge too far, right?
No, actually, I was trying to justify my own video by by watching their own and watching theirs, and I've seen. We write outside of literature often, and everybody, we've all gone through undergraduate studies where you have to take science, so I'm familiar with the tables and the percentages. I was able to actually understand what the results were, which is great. But to try to bridge that, I was thinking, and me and Steve spoke about this before we recorded our videos, like how we would do it. We knew we were in a group with psychology grads, and they're much more methods and results based, versus we can just sit here and pontificate about the significance and the importance of relativity of interest of life writing. It's a totally different, like you said, it's completely different avenues of research. But I was trying to justify it. I was like, my presentation ended with me reading the letter, which is essentially them presenting their table of results. That's the end result of the process, and the methods was the actual product with the annotations at the bottom, which I guess would be like the asterisks on their table that of certain meanings. So There is correlation. It's just this completely abstract correlation. It's totally relative. If you can figure it out, you can find it, but and you have to kind of weed through a bunch of stuff to figure out how any of this stuff's related. But I was able to see some of trajectory anyway. I wasn't lost in their presentations at all, which I was very proud of myself for.
So I can't keep my mouth shut. I did hit record, but now I can't keep my mouth shut. So, but Zach, you asked, I think, like this really fantastic question, or talked about your approach, and it was, what questions need to be asked? And I think that that's a really, incredibly philosophical, but way for all the psychology folks too, and so maybe Maddie can tell us, like, what questions need to be asked with what she has, found. The same thing with Adam and Meg, what questions need to be asked from, what you uncovered, or what you didn't uncover, what you were hoping to uncover that maybe went awry. That's very similar, I think, to the process that, that y'all discovered with the letters. So.
Yeah, I think the questions that still need to be answered are basically the same questions that I started with. I don't think that in the nature of this level of graduate psychology research that I'm ever going to be able to answer more questions than we uncover. The starting point, I think, for me was a little more practical in terms of, there's this very specific real world problem that has financial implications, that has life outcome implications. Wilderness therapy, which is the topic of mine, is incredibly expensive for families to put their kids into. And so there is this question of, for whom is it worth it? For whom does this actually show improvement? And so that's the question that I had started with, was, can we use a personality and psychopathology screen as basically a screener for treatment? And specifically using personality measures to say, okay, is there anything in here that could indicate that somebody is going to do well or not do well in this kind of treatment program? Because there isn't really any research on that. And if you think about from a kind of business capitalist standpoint, wilderness programs have no reason to do that research, because all it's going to do is cut down their target market. So it kind of falls on the rest of us to be able to say, okay, how can I responsibly recommend that a family spend $40,000 for a month to treat their kids? So I found this result of a measure of disconstraint, or a kind of lack of self-control, as a good thing for treatment in wilderness. That's something that wilderness can really effectively treat. Things like substance abuse, ADHD, conduct problems, that all kind of is in the same family. But the question that I came out with was from this kind of other result, that what we often refer to as neuroticism, or kind of negative emotionality, indicated actually a worsening of violent symptoms. And that is completely contrary to what any, admissions counselor at a wilderness program would try to tell you. That all of a sudden, okay, if you have somebody that's high in neuroticism, you don't want to send them here. So that, I think, opens up this entire world of questions of, are these therapeutic programs not addressing internalizing symptoms? Are they not addressing anxiety and depression as well as they could be? Or is it just not as easy to treat? And so there's this whole question of, what is the mechanism of change that's happening in this particular treatment modality? That's not particularly well examined in current research. There's a lot of controversy about wilderness programs. And so just being able to better understand that should be kind of a universal goal for anyone working either in wilderness therapy, but also just working with adolescents in the mental health field. So there are still so many questions on how we can best use a modality that could be very effective, but is also very expensive.
Yeah, Maddie, I kind of agree with that. I think I do a lot of my research with the LGBTQ population, and because it is such an under-researched population, every time I do a project, I feel like I come up with 3 more questions that I want the answer to, just because it's so under-researched. Like, especially with this project that I did my recording on, we found that there was definitely a difference between sexual minorities, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, and how their coming out process had an impact on them versus transgender individuals. It wasn't the same. So then that just gives more questions as to, so what does that process then look like for transgender individuals, and why is there that difference there, and what can we do to address it moving forward? So yeah, I think it's just more questions that come from research on one.
Let me throw one quick comment, and then Laura, were you starting to talk? Dr. Wright? Were you starting to say something? Okay. As I was listening to both Zach and Steve talk, and then Maddie, there's a distinction in the history of psychology about our approach to questions. And it's ideographic versus nomothetic is the arcane terminology here. And ideographic research is when you focused on the unique experience of one individual. You're looking at that individual's life story, for example. Nomothetic is when you're looking, like Maddie's is clearly nomothetic. You can't get a mean unless you have a group. You can't get a correlation coefficient unless you have 2 groups. Does that make sense? So we're looking at patterns across people, common patterns. In even Megan's, where she's separating the coming out experience, in all of those cases, it's groups that are being compared with each other. It's where we find generalizable truth. And so psychology as a field has drifted clearly toward the nomothetic approach to seeking truth. But in the history of our field, ideographic approaches it's in no way criticized. It's said you have to have both. I mean, our history says you seek truth through ideographic and nomothetic approaches, compared and contrasted, and you learn from both, and they're both necessary. It's just in real life, we in modern psychology, we have tended to go largely toward this nomothetic, this group-based approach, where we take people and get averages and means and statistics reflecting groups, instead of this drilling down uniquely into the life of one individual. It's interesting to hear this play out on this in the same group of people on the screen here. I'm looking at faces to see who's got the next.
Well, I would love to hear Adam talk a little bit about kind of the, questions that drove him to his study, and then the questions maybe he left with.
My biggest interest was just in general suicide risk and bringing kind of awareness to suicide. It's a funny thing to say because we obviously all are aware of suicide. We may even have had some knowledge going into this that, suicide is a particularly problematic in the young adult population, but it still has a certain taboo, a certain fear about even talking about it. And so even though that seems to be a far off concept, part of the reason of my project was just to bring the awareness that this is something that we have at Western, that this is something in our own student population, our own backyard, so to speak, students that all of you interact with. And the questions that I intended to kind of generate at the end of this study, because mine, the portions that I shared for this project were just simply descriptive, showing just the rates in the student population of suicide risk and different risk factors of suicide, was what can we do as a university to better serve our students, to better address these types of issues, and to try and bring some awareness that those types of interventions aren't necessarily that costly and could be done and could be integrated into the university. including like student trainings. I think a lot of times whenever you hear the word suicide risk, you immediately think, oh, this person needs professional intervention. And the truth of the matter is that's not always the case. Somebody can have small elevations in suicide risk and still be able to function appropriately and safely in just general everyday life with support from their just support groups, and educating students to where they can be a better friend, a better support to fellow students who may have different levels of suicide risk is a big factor that goes into it. And also just educating people about suicide in general. I think there's often this fear that just talking about suicide, if you do that with somebody who has suicide risk, that you're going to increase their risk. And we know from research that that's just not true, that talking about suicide and even their past suicidal behavior does not actually increase their current risk. So just trying to bring some awareness to that and try and generate some questions to how as a campus, how as leadership on campus could we work towards addressing this issue.
David, could I ask a question?
Certainly.
I and this is really for all of the presenters here. Your research projects are interested in answering one or more specific kinds of questions, right? So you hopefully have finished this, and I think for the folks in our partner college, you have a very specific kind of research question that you're looking at, and you may or may not have answered that, and may have elicited more questions, and the grad students in our program are looking at specific questions within these texts. But I'm going to ask you to sort of take a step back, and I'm wondering, what did you learn about your work and the kind of work you do? What's the new tool you have in your belt that you'll carry with you from doing a project like this, right? What is that thing that this kind of engaged and applied research that we really want to foster here, what did that do to help you in your own kind of career goals?
I think for me, coming into graduate school, this was one of the first projects that I worked on. It was one of the first projects I did, and it was a population that I knew I had interest in, but I think this project really helped me solidify that interest. And I actually, got to look at some of the data and look at these experiences, even though it was overall as a group and not specifically in an individual or one or two individuals. For me, it really just solidified that, these experiences are really important. They have important effects. They have important implications for the lives of these individuals, and that the work is worth doing, and kind of just continue to foster that curiosity that I've always had about this specific group. So that to me was something that I took away from this, just to keep me going in research. And I think that's always important. You want that fuel behind you to just keep looking at more questions, even if you're just creating more in the end. You want to keep going.
I would say for me, and Steve might be able to add to this as well. For us, it's one of the first chances to see immediate impact of our work. We can write papers, and even if we submit them to journals for publication, sometimes that's just essentially thoughts and arguments and debates, versus this had real utility. Our work that we did was directly added to an archive. It was directly furthering a project that Hunter Library is working on. It was immediately, you can Google Laura Kephart and my name, and it comes up on NC Docs, and it's like it's an official, it's a thing. It's an immediate. There's that immediate gratification of function, I guess. It's something that you can write all these papers, and I think of all these great things, and I'm expanding my interpretations of these works and these people and these writers, but to be able to sit down and do the work and transcribe it, do all this research that mimics research that you do in literary studies, but it's much different, researching real places and real people, but the methods are about the same. To mimic that and to see it immediately go into action was something really new. And so it kind of gave me that first jolt of, like I said, impact. It's something that happened. It's tangible. I really did it, instead of I got a grade on something, sure, but it actually exists in the real world as well. So it's kind of a first voyage into that realm. So as far as career goes, it just kind of it gave me shed a little bit of a light on what that's going to be like, to see your work exist outside of a classroom is something that was new. Is tangible, even though it's on the internet. I guess it's digitally tangible. Say, yeah. So it was just something totally new and different, which furthered, my interest. Is like, I'm going to keep doing things like this because I can now see it immediately in the real world.
Yeah, I definitely got a better idea of how that structure and how that how everything goes into the research methods and methodology, and kind of if somebody wants to go into the PhD realm, this is a good start. And it's also a good motivation to kind of see your name, like Zach was saying. You could type in my name, WCU, and it's like the fourth thing that pops up or whatever. But it really is nice. And Dr. Wright was great with being as transparent as possible with how difficult it can be to publish. But she kind of gave us the lay of the land and how to approach it and tips and tricks. And it was really nice to kind of see my name and see that my work was going noticed, and it's not going to go through this intense thorough review and then it's going to be sent back. But we still know that that's a thing, and that's something we're going to have to do. But this was a great kind of stepping stone, baby step, whatever you want to call it. So that's a great tool that I think both Zach and I now share going forward in our careers, education, so on and so forth.
Dr. Wright?
Yeah, so I don't want to interrupt the rest of the presenters kind of answering this question, because I definitely want to hear their answers as well. But I did want to say that with regard to these letters, you're right, they didn't go through like a peer review process, but everybody in the class was also sort of collaborating on figuring out maybe what certain words were, if they were difficult to understand. So there was this peer collaboration. And then of course, I reviewed it, and so there was, but it was just on a smaller scale. So yeah, you got like the real life dose of this, just on a smaller scale.
I would say something that I learned from this process is one, you could still do research in the age of COVID via Zoom, and that it is possible to have a tough conversation, like, asking somebody about past suicidal behavior and stuff like that. A complete stranger you've never met before, you've just made them answer thousands of questions that took them 45 minutes to do, and then you asked them, our project also included a substance use interview, so you've asked them about any substance use history they have, and then you end it all by asking them about suicide. And just the fact of how many students we've had that stay through that entire process, the fact that they feel comfortable enough sharing that information, and that they will share that information. And also something that I realized more as I was doing this project is that in cases where you don't have to use deception, a lot of social psychology has to use deception because of what they're looking at. We didn't use any kind of deception, so it was pretty obvious what we were targeting. But it made me realize that the actual participants themselves do care. I think before this project, I always had it kind of ingrained in my mind that this was just a requirement. Students, the undergrad students in the gen psych class, they have to do these credits or they have to write a really long paper. So they're going to do the credits, path of least resistance. And so I just always had it in my mind that they weren't really necessarily engaged or caring about what the topic was. But the number of people, especially those who did have some history of suicide risk, who at the end of it all said, I really enjoyed participating in this study. I do think this is something that's needed. I think this is things that we could improve on. Seeing that engagement kind of changed my mindset and made me rethink, maybe I need to spend as much time as we did on this project, for example, on the informed consent form. We put a lot of time and did a lot of explaining in that. It really changed my mind of the way I think about that, because up until then it was like just the usual kind of business contract that's a boilerplate form that you do the same for everything. But I would argue that maybe that did influence the participants we had, because it clued them in on the seriousness of the topic and made them engage more.
I would say that I learned to engage on two different scales. On a very, very field-specific scale, the particular assessments that I was using exist in a very, very small kind of world within the field. The adolescent MMPI is new. No one really works on it. There's very little research on it. And so it's very interesting to get to enter an otherwise very, very small sector of the field this early on, and be able to have an immediate discussion point, say, for doctoral programs, or just kind of with networking, be able to say that I've worked on this thing that not very many people have worked on. From a larger scale, I also appreciate the opportunity to kind of be forced to communicate my results in a way that is digestible. The very nature of kind of my statistical project was a huge correlation matrix, and that can get very overwhelming even as the person who is knee deep in it. But it's comforting that I can look back and say, okay, I did actually, I managed to actually do the statistics, but also say, I can, from this huge amount of data, I can actually interpret it in a way that, somebody can understand without a doctoral level degree in psychology, without a master's level degree in psychology, that we can have projects that create impactful results that are not just appreciated within our little tiny world. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Those were really great answers. I was and touching answers for those of us who are faculty here to hear what you took away from that. I was half expecting to hear, oh, I learned SPSS. Do you guys use SPSS anymore over there, right? Right? But those are much more significant outcomes. And I'll say, Madeline, just returning to one of David's earlier questions about like your data set at the end of your paper. I was sort of thinking about that, and I went back online and took a look at that part in the presentation. And for those of us in English studies, we sort of recognize that as a really important rhetorical move, right? People may not understand the stats that are at work there, but for someone outside the field, we expect to see something like that there. And we expect that anything that's going to be published like that has been, the stats have been vetted by somebody like Dr. McCord, who can, kind of verify that that's correct. And we can then move on to better agree with the conclusions that you make too, right? It's a very rhetorical move to have those kinds, and all disciplines have that, right? All disciplines have these sort of rhetorical moves in their research that include specific kinds of scholarship and research and research methods and things of that nature. So great.
you need to speak up if anybody has any questions to interject. I've got things going through my mind. And one quick thing, I need to defend the tiny world concept that Maddie was talking about. A dear departed colleague, not departed, retired colleague, Hal Herzog, that many people on the screen know, had told me that he had learned over the course of his long successful, productive life, is that the key to happiness is choosing the right pond to swim in. And so for some of us, having a really tiny world, having a real tiny pond has been a good move, is what I'm just speaking personally. So I don't want to completely disparage the tiny world, that we might find ourselves in. Sometimes
Is
that's
he
the key
still
to
telling that
happiness.
story?
He is. He stands by it too. He does. Let me ask. I do want to ask one thing, and it is a tiny little question, but it gets at some of the interesting things we talked about between our two research traditions of the English and psychology, and I need to preface it with a really clear statement to Zach and Steve. This your analyses of these letters were fascinating and really interesting. I've just had some casual interactions with my students about that very fact. And there were some comments in both cases on handwriting, on the quality of the handwriting, I think, especially with Steve's. Okay, so to clarify what I'm saying, those comments were fascinating and interesting, and I don't question the validity of those of your impressions that you communicated about the handwriting. Now, shift gears. In the book, The 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology, one of those 50 is the myth of graphology. Okay, that the study of handwriting to infer personality characteristics is BS. And that's a domothetic finding, is that there's no correlation between the features of handwriting, like left slant or right slant, or the size. Big writing means a big ego. It's narcissistic people write big. That I love, one of my favorites is that when those letters that go below the line, like a G, that if there's an emphasis on that, if the part below the line is a little bigger, there's a fascination with genitalia. Okay, so graphology has got a inglorious history. And in modern psychology, looking at it from an empirical standpoint, it's discredited. It's a myth because we don't find in group research statistically significant and stable associations between those handwriting features and personality traits or tendencies or symptoms. Does that make sense from a nomological standpoint? At the same time, y'all were both free to make inferences about Laura based on some aspects of her handwriting that I personally found to be compelling and interesting, without raising any questions in my mind about, wait a minute, is this BS graphology? That never came up in my mind. I was completely enwrapped by your narrative. So how do I reconcile those two things there?
So I don't know if I necessarily, and I can't speak on Steve's interpretation of the handwriting. I didn't necessarily use it to speak about her personality as much as just where she was at in her life as different stage of where she was before on record with the other letters. But to try to answer that question, I guess it would be an artistic observation that then informed the more kind of methodological observations of that later came in through the project. Because that's something, it's just an aesthetic. It's just a visual observation that we're noticing. It's she in mine, I think she had her capital W's have it's essentially two V's put together. The middle is just as big. So it got really high up on the middle part. That doesn't happen early. It's just these little quirks and observations. I don't necessarily know if that informs or plays a part in our interpretation of her as a person. versus just seeing where she's at and kind of picking out these idiosyncrasies about her. And that does, but it does, like having them in a box over here, like she has these things about her handwriting that's unique to Laura, but individually those little quirks and those little errors or these blips that she does, these inconsistencies in her handwriting, individually that doesn't necessarily play a role into her personality, but as put them all together, and they do, everybody has, like you're talking about with the graphology, everybody has different ways that they write on paper. I mean, if I write a full page of paper, and I don't do it very often, so my hand gets tired and there's like 3 different handwritings on the same page, so I would look like a split personality. You're looking at it like that, there's like 3 or 4 different people writing this one thing. But everybody has, like, you know, you swoop your P's a certain way. Some people do their 7s or Z's and they put a dash in the middle of it. Yeah, everybody has these certain tendencies. So when you put them and you culminate them together, yes, that can speak to like a personality trait or of some sort, I think, when you're observing it the way we observe it. But individually, no. I think it's the combination of just sitting back and seeing how she structures and how she constructs her letters kind of adds to it. It might not change either way. It's not going to sway you either way on how you feel about her or what you think about her. It's just something else to observe about it. It's how I think about it. I don't know. Steve could have a totally different approach to it. He went way further into the handwriting than I did, only because my grandma wrote in cursive my whole life, so I was used to reading it. So I didn't have to do as deep of a dive for it. But yeah, so Steve might have something way different to add.
No, it's pretty on par. I guess what I was looking for specifically was because mine was significantly later, so it was the only one from, well, at the time, there's more now, but in the digital collections, that was from 1954. And I think the next one was 1946, like December 1946 or something like that. And it's significantly, I don't want to say messier, but it almost had this tilt to it. So I was trying to see if I could figure out anything about what caused that by chance, if there was some sort of like cognitive issue or something like that. In terms of the graphology aspect of it, I wasn't really looking in that idea. It was also a way to kind of, like Dr. Wright was saying earlier, mingle and kind of discuss research ideas and annotation ideas and ways of transcribing with my, I guess, classmates in terms of our own little peer review club that we had within 618. So it was actually more of a practice in the annotation process. I never really thought of it having some sort of like,
Did
I don't know if Steve froze or if I froze.
Steve froze.
All right. Yes. So I hear the thunder out there, so it could happen to any of us.
Dave, can I jump in here real quick, just to
Sure.
kind of follow up on that? It's sort of a chicken and egg question, because handwriting depends to some extent, and sometimes to a great extent, on where you learned and how you learned to write, and those kinds of practices. So in medieval studies, for example, where we talk about scribal communities a great deal, where you learn in a very strict and rigorous way how to write in a very specific kind of script. They refer to that as a community of practice. So yeah, it's you might say, oh, so you can't really interrogate a personality based upon that writing style, except if you flip it around and say, who are the people that go into that kind of place where you learn to write that way, right? So I mean, just for the top of my head, people who came through, say, a Catholic school system might, have a different kind of personality that came through a different kind of school system, just as anybody else who has learned to write in different places, their personality is affected by that culture, right? The culture of that taught them how to write.
Mhm.
Can I ask a really quick question? I have to leave in a couple minutes to go to class, but I was, I believe somebody had said that your letters were sort of assigned to you for this project, but I'm wondering, Zach, if you say, do you see this type of research being a part of what you do sort of in your future, sort of examining life writing? And if so, how do you think you're going to go about like selecting your subject matter? How do you come up with the research question?
That's a great question because I'm doing that now. I have another project where we're working with the Frank Fry collection out of Hewitt, kind of again Bryson City, Swain County area, and that one's much more open than this. So we have the entire collection, all these plated photographs that we can go through, and then we ask our own, like we essentially pick a photograph and then formulate our own questions after that. I'm focusing on this place is called Worley's Cabin. There's a photo of that, and it was a Cherokee cabin original structure and land was Cherokee cabin. It was bought by someone else, and then bought by a white person, a white family who moved the Cherokee out, but to a better plot of land. You know, obviously we have arguments of ancestral heritage and land rights with that in question, but they moved them to what is essentially a better plot of land, closer to water, flatter area to farm. But they bought this cabin because they wanted this thing. So I'm trying to formulate this question of, do I want to research why this plot of land was valuable to them? Was it the structure itself? Was the wood logged locally? Was it brought in? Is it non-native wood that's brought into this area and then built this cabin on top of it? Is the construction style, any sort of blend of native and colonizers style? Can you find structures that look like it somewhere else? Like it's essentially that thing. What question? I'm looking at this picture. I'm like, okay, what questions need to be asked for this picture to see beyond it? To see beyond this little frame that I have. Like, what can I put in that's going to allow me to figure out more about it? In the past, I actually have experience with special collections and things. In my undergraduate studies, we did Civil War transcription letters, and I had family letters back then. So the questions for that was more genealogical, trying to contextualize my own family history through this. And so that was, it was a Quaker ancestor. So it's answering questions for, he was a prisoner in a Confederate war prison in Salisbury. Because he refused to fight. So he was a traitor, essentially. So there's questions of prison conditions in the Civil War. There's questions of Quakers' role during the Civil War in North Carolina. There's also questions for my personal family, like how did that a moment right there? How does his imprisonment transcend later down the line and eventually to me? You essentially ask all those questions. And then your research kind of tells you which one you might get close to answering. Like you have to ask all the questions, and then you just kind of say, okay, this one's too far out. This one I can't. There's nothing there for that one. This one's just hearsay. You kind of fiddle through it and puddle through and figure out what the answers. The question that you land on is just essentially what's available to you. You have to ask all this stuff. There's like, I think Meg said you're covering way more questions than you're answering. So you're constantly just asking. You just have to, hopefully for this Frank Fry project, I'm able to just land on something concrete that helps me understand it. And when it pushes out into the Omeka collection at Hunter Library, it can help somebody who stumbles upon it, understand what everything that was going on in that picture. Hope that answered a question in some sort of way. Went like way left field for that, but okay.
Thank you. I'm going to step out and go to class, but it's been a really, really interesting presentation. And I'll self-disclose slightly and say that when I was a psychology student, I very briefly dated an English student. And part of the reason why it was very brief was because we just thought about things very differently. And I heard you're so concretized, probably about 40 times in that short amount of time that we were meeting. So it's been really just interesting to hear about the different perspectives and approaches to research. And so thank you all, and I appreciate it.
See, David. Yeah, I agree with Solomon's comments there. It's been really interesting to hear. And I was getting hopeful of bridging some gaps. There's a psychologist, Dan McAdams at Northwestern University he floats above the rest of us. He's got 3 levels of personality, and I definitely live on level 1, and all of my research does, and no question about that. Level 2, we touch on. He's really focused on level 3, and that's where y'all are. It's the life narrative. It's the story of the life. And it's really interesting. You can't quantify it. You have to approach those questions differently, which he does. He's not in the psych department at Northwestern. He's in some integrated department with a real long name of some sort. But then I was thinking there was hope, like we could unite through McAdams. And then Zach, you sounded just as interested in that cabin as you did in Laura Kephart. And then I had to sit back and think, maybe not, maybe we're not. But it did sound fascinating.
Well, the listening to it, the thing that I keep going back to is what oftentimes goes on in personality theory classes. That and history of psychology classes are really the only times we talk about the person whose theory we're discussing or when different. And I think that's something that we oftentimes as psychologists lose sight of, and that we don't think about, not only in terms of, if you look at all of the old school personality theorists, their life experiences mirrored their theory. a lot of what happened to them ended up becoming major parts of their theory. And of course, they were influenced by the culture and whatnot at the time. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. And we also lose sight of the fact of what's influencing me right now. I feel like I'm the one who's in charge of my own research, but that's not entirely true. There are other forces at work in terms of the culture, my own life, my own personality that is feeding into the work that I've chosen to do. And I think that can be really helpful if we step back and ask ourselves that, because it helps defend against biases and different things like that. But also is just interesting because we have a better understanding of our own narrative, our own role in I guess the work that we're doing.
David, if I could just make a quick comment too. This is specifically for can't get over that. I keep pointing to the person on my screen, and of course you have no idea where anybody is on the screen. I'm pointing to Meg, right, Megan? Okay. I don't know if you know of Travis Roundtree, Dr. Roundtree in our department, but he's in the process of working on an LGBTQ archive, Southern Appalachian LGBTQ archive, oral history archive. And I think, as I was looking at what you were working on, I thought, oh, wow, it'd be great, if you could be involved in something like that. And in part, it's because we may approach things differently, but we are often approaching the same kinds of questions, right? What is it, how human beings are human beings, and what makes them happy and what makes them sad, and how can we be productive, and how can we do good in the world and avoid evil, and all of that sort of stuff. They're the same kinds of questions generally. They're just kind of different approaches to it. And I wanted to mention Dr. Roundtree to you because I think, if you are interested in pursuing work on the LGBTQ community, that might be a project you might want to get involved in, because it's going to be really spectacular.
Thank you. I'll definitely look into that. Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody for a really fascinating session. I totally enjoyed it. I was glad. Once again, y'all reinforced my lack of creativity and dependence on everybody around me to carry the ball, and it worked again, and I appreciate that and enjoy being here. So see you all later.